Arthur Schopenhauer, the grim genius of pessimism, didn't just critique life, he dissected it with brutal honesty. Among his most controversial views were his warnings to men about the true nature of most women. While modern ears might find his words jarring, they were rooted in a deep philosophical inquiry into desire, power, and human nature. In this video, we explore what Schopenhauer actually said, why he believed it, and why his message was dismissed, even though some of it might still ring true today. Arthur Schopenhauer wasn't just a philosopher, he was a surgeon of the soul, slicing into the illusions of human life with cold precision. To understand his warning to men about women, we have to start with the very core of his philosophy, his belief that existence itself is suffering. He saw the world not as a place of beauty or moral progress, but as a brutal battlefield governed by an invisible, insatiable force he called the will. This will is not rational. It doesn't care about your dreams, your values, or your personal happiness. It just wants one thing: to survive and reproduce. And according to Schopenhauer, this will operates through us, without our conscious awareness. It drives us to chase things that we think we want: status, love, wealth, but only to keep us trapped in a cycle of endless striving and disappointment. Unlike other philosophers who placed reason or morality at the center of life, Schopenhauer placed suffering at the center. Everything we do, he said, is a reaction to pain or discomfort. Joy is not real. It's just a brief relief from suffering. From this bleak worldview, he developed one of his most radical insights: that human relationships, especially between men and women, are not what they seem. On the surface, relationships look like they're about love, companionship, and mutual understanding. But Schopenhauer argued that this is an illusion created by nature to trick us into reproduction. He believed that most men walk around under a powerful spell, an enchantment cast by the will. This spell is what makes men idealize women, fall in love, and risk everything for a fleeting promise of pleasure or emotional connection. But in reality, these feelings are not noble. They're biological strategies meant to continue the species. Nature, Schopenhauer said, doesn't care if a man is happy in love. It only cares if he passes on his genes. This is the beginning of his warning, one that most men still refuse to hear. Romantic love, in Schopenhauer's eyes, was the most successful lie ever invented by nature. He didn't deny that love felt powerful. In fact, he acknowledged just how overwhelming it could be. But that was the point. Its power is what makes it so dangerous. Schopenhauer claimed that when a man falls in love, he's no longer himself. He becomes a puppet of the will, guided not by logic or wisdom, but by instinct and illusion. Everything he does, buying gifts, making sacrifices, writing poetry, is done not for true joy, but for a biological mission hidden beneath the surface. He warned that this mission almost always leads to suffering. First comes the obsession, then the attachment, then the realization that the person he idealized was never who he imagined. Schopenhauer believed that men don't fall in love with real women. They fall in love with projections of their desires, fantasies crafted by the will to bind them. Once the illusion fades, they're often left with regret, emotional emptiness, and in many cases, lifelong burdens like unhappy marriages, financial stress, or children they weren't ready to raise. Even worse, Schopenhauer noted that this trap disproportionately affects men. Why? Because he saw men as more vulnerable to the illusion of beauty and desire. A man, driven by visual attraction and ego, can become completely irrational in the presence of a woman who seems to promise fulfillment. But that promise is a mirage. It's a sales pitch from nature, and once the product is delivered, often through sex or reproduction, the illusion collapses. Schopenhauer didn't say this out of bitterness alone, though many accused him of that. He said it because he believed most men live in ignorance of their deepest motivations. They don't understand why they suffer in relationships, why they feel betrayed, or why love turns into pain. He wanted to wake them up, not to hate women, but to stop worshipping the idea of them. In his view, the man who sees clearly will not be enslaved by love. He will see it for what it is, a powerful biological force, worthy of caution, not blind devotion. In his infamous essay, On Women, Schopenhauer did what few dared to do in his time: strip away the romanticized image of womanhood and examine it through the lens of raw philosophical analysis. While his words are often branded as deeply misogynistic today, they were, from his perspective, a brutal attempt to reveal what he believed to be the biological and psychological realities of female nature. He wasn't writing as a social reformer or a politician. He was a metaphysical realist, and the reality he saw was harsh. Schopenhauer claimed that most women were not interested in truth, genius, or philosophical greatness. Unlike men, who he believed had the potential to transcend their biological impulses through reason, creativity, and spiritual pursuit, he thought women were primarily grounded in the material and emotional world. In his view, their instincts were centered on security, survival, and reproduction, and nearly everything they did could be traced back to those motives. He saw femininity not as a soft or sacred force, but as cunning and pragmatic, evolved for navigating the dangers of life through manipulation rather than confrontation. He wrote that women are, by nature, meant to obey, not out of cruelty, but out of the belief that their strength was not in physical or intellectual dominance, but in psychological leverage. According to him, women developed mastery over the subtle arts of persuasion, emotional appeal, and seduction, tools that nature gave them to survive in a world where brute force was the domain of men. Schopenhauer didn't deny that women had power. He simply believed it was of a different kind: indirect, emotional, and socially constructed. He also argued that most women lack what he called the metaphysical sense, the deep yearning for truth and meaning that drives artists, philosophers, and saints. While he admired asceticism, sacrifice, and solitude, he believed women were more bound to comfort, appearance, and interpersonal drama. This, in his mind, made them unsuitable for higher pursuits like philosophy or art, which required detachment from the petty concerns of the everyday world. But perhaps his harshest judgment was on what he perceived as women's relationship with truth. Schopenhauer accused them of being inherently deceptive, not maliciously, but instinctively. He claimed that the survival of women through history depended on their ability to mask their intentions, to charm and mislead when necessary, and to use emotional sensitivity not to understand the world, but to bend it to their advantage. In his most biting passages, he described women as having a deep connection to the present moment, but a limited grasp of larger ideals or long-term consequences. He didn't exclude exceptions. He acknowledged that some women were capable of deep thought and virtue, but he treated these cases as rare and extraordinary. The general rule in his mind was that most women were not interested in the noble or the eternal, but in what was useful, pleasant, and emotionally satisfying in the short term. What's shocking is not just the content of Schopenhauer's critique, but how unapologetically he delivered it. In an age of poetic odes to feminine beauty and virtue, Schopenhauer delivered a philosophical scalpel. He didn't care for decorum or popularity. He cared for what he saw as the truth. And in his truth, most men were being deceived, not just by women, but by their own fantasies about women. Given how severe and unsettling these claims were, it's no surprise that they were met with outrage, mockery, and dismissal. But Schopenhauer wasn't surprised. He knew his ideas would be unpopular, especially among the very people he believed were trapped by the illusions he was trying to expose. His writings on women were buried, ignored, or condemned, even as his other works gained respect in philosophical circles. Men, he believed, did not want to hear the truth, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they feared disillusionment. The fantasy of love, the idea of the ideal woman, the hope of romantic salvation. These were comforting lies. To confront Schopenhauer's perspective would mean questioning one's entire emotional framework, and for most men, that was too high a price. He wrote that men were often complicit in their own manipulation. They clung to stories of romance, beauty, and maternal virtue, even when the reality in front of them contradicted those myths. They ignored the cold stares, the manipulation, the emotional games, because to admit that love was an illusion was to admit that they had been fooled. And no man likes to admit that. This is why, Schopenhauer believed, his warnings fell on deaf ears. His goal was not to inspire hatred, but to shatter delusion. He wanted men to reclaim their reason, to stop idolizing women as divine beings and see them as what they truly were, human, flawed, driven by instinct like everyone else. But this awakening was painful, and most preferred to remain asleep. In the end, Schopenhauer's writings serve not as a manual for misogyny, but as a philosophical challenge, a dare to question the deepest assumptions men carry about love, desire, and the opposite sex. Whether one agrees or disagrees, the discomfort his ideas provoke is precisely what makes them worth exploring. Because if we never examine our illusions, how can we ever be free? In our modern age, where gender roles are rapidly evolving, relationships are more complex than ever, and countless men find themselves feeling lost, betrayed, or disillusioned, Schopenhauer's dark warnings are beginning to resurface. What once sounded like the bitter ramblings of a misanthropic bachelor now reads, to some, like a brutally honest prophecy. As men struggle to navigate a landscape filled with shifting expectations, emotional entanglements, and the overwhelming influence of media-driven fantasies, many are asking a deeply uncomfortable question: was Schopenhauer right all along? At the time he wrote, Schopenhauer's ideas were scandalous, not only because they criticized women, but because they attacked the very foundation of romantic idealism. He didn't just critique behavior, he dismantled the sacred mythology of love. He challenged the notion that love was pure, that it uplifted the soul, or that it led to lasting happiness. He saw love, especially romantic love between men and women, as a carefully engineered illusion, a biological strategy cloaked in poetry, designed to keep the human species reproducing. Today, this illusion is more seductive than ever. Hollywood romantic comedies, social media highlight reels, dating apps, and consumer culture all play into a carefully curated fantasy of love. But behind that illusion, many modern men report the same painful themes Schopenhauer identified nearly 2 centuries ago: emotional manipulation, a sense of powerlessness in relationships, a fear of betrayal, or the crushing weight of legal and financial responsibility following a breakup or divorce. While society continues to celebrate the ideal of romantic fulfillment, Schopenhauer's old warnings echo louder than ever for those who feel abandoned by that dream. Modern psychology and evolutionary biology have only added fuel to the fire. Research shows that many of our choices in love are not conscious at all. We're driven by hormones, social conditioning, and deeply rooted survival mechanisms. Concepts like hypergamy, mate value, and reproductive strategy, though sometimes misused, point to the same truth Schopenhauer saw. Love is rarely about the soul. It's about biology, status, and emotional utility. The man who believes otherwise, he suggested, is setting himself up for pain. This doesn't mean Schopenhauer was flawless in his thinking. He generalized harshly. He viewed women through a single lens, heavily influenced by his personal experiences and a philosophical system designed to emphasize suffering and futility. Many critics, then and now, argue that his perspective was deeply imbalanced. Not all women fit his description. Not all love is deception. And some relationships, built on mutual growth, respect, and self-awareness, do in fact transcend the primitive drives he described. But the power of Schopenhauer's work lies not in its fairness, but in its boldness. He didn't try to be diplomatic. He tried to be honest. And in that honesty, many modern men are finding a strange kind of liberation. Because once you recognize the mechanics behind the illusion, you can stop being a slave to it. You stop chasing a fantasy that was never designed to serve your soul. You begin to see clearly, to think critically, and to build your relationships on truth instead of blind hope. Some men who encounter Schopenhauer's work feel a sense of betrayal. Why weren't they taught this earlier? Why does no one speak of the darker realities of love? Why is a man expected to sacrifice everything in the name of romance, only to be mocked or discarded when it no longer serves the other person's needs? These are not just philosophical questions. They're deeply personal ones, born from real pain, disillusionment, and the collapse of once-cherished ideals. And perhaps this is why Schopenhauer is becoming more relevant today than he ever was during his lifetime. He speaks to the man who has been through heartbreak, who has lost his identity in a relationship, who has watched his efforts and devotion go unrewarded. He speaks not with comfort, but with clarity, not with hope, but with freedom, the freedom that comes from seeing the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. But Schopenhauer didn't just leave men in despair. While he was known for his pessimism, his ultimate solution wasn't hatred, it was detachment. He believed the path to peace lay in withdrawing from illusions, mastering desire, and cultivating inner strength. He urged men to rise above the primitive forces within them, to seek solitude, art, philosophy, and spiritual depth as alternatives to emotional enslavement. Love, if it must exist, should not dominate a man's life. It should not consume his sense of purpose. It should never blind him to truth. In the end, the question is not whether Schopenhauer was completely right or wrong. It's whether we're brave enough to examine what he saw. His warning wasn't just about women. It was about the illusions that destroy men from the inside, the fantasy of romantic salvation, the belief that someone else can complete us, the hope that desire leads to fulfillment. For those willing to hear it, Schopenhauer offers a kind of harsh medicine, bitter but perhaps for some, healing.